A white officer arrests two black girls outside a wealthy neighborhood, without asking their names. Minutes later, he finds out they're the police chief's daughters, and now he's behind bars. But what follows is more than scandal. It's a painful reckoning that could change everything. Can he earn back the trust he shattered, or is the damage already done? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Through the hazy heat of a Georgia summer afternoon, Officer Zach Hill slouched in his patrol car, the air conditioning working overtime against the oppressive warmth. The digital clock on his dashboard read 12:42 p.m. He took another bite of his burger, now barely warm, and grimaced at how the bun had gone slightly soggy. The sweet tea in his cup holder offered little comfort. It was mostly melted ice at this point. His phone screen showed the latest sports scores, though he wasn't really paying attention. The afternoon lull had settled in, and his mind wandered to the mountain of yard work waiting for him at home. The radio's sudden crackle made him jump, nearly dropping his phone. Unit 4B, respond to Willow Heights Gate. Caller reports two suspicious black females loitering outside the premises. Possible trespassing. Zach sighed heavily, crumpling up the burger wrapper. These kinds of calls, he muttered, tossing the garbage onto the passenger seat. It landed among empty coffee cups and old receipts. He keyed his radio. Unit 4B responding. The patrol car's engine hummed to life, and Zach pulled out of the gas station lot. He didn't bother calling for backup. He'd handled dozens of these situations before. Usually just kids hanging around where they shouldn't be, or someone's domestic help waiting for their ride. Nothing he couldn't handle alone. As he drove, his mind ran through the familiar script: assess the situation, establish authority, and clear the area if needed. Simple, routine, by the book. The streets of Crestfield rolled past his windows, the neat suburban landscapes giving way to more manicured properties as he approached Willow Heights. The exclusive community's entrance came into view, marked by its signature wrought iron gates and perfectly maintained landscaping. Tall oak trees lined the entrance, their thick branches offering patches of shade across the pristine concrete. The brick pillars on either side of the gate stood like silent sentinels, their surfaces clean and unmarred, a stark contrast to other parts of town. Just as reported, two teenage girls stood near the gate. Zach slowed his approach, taking in the scene. One girl leaned against the brick wall, her posture relaxed but dignified. She wore neat jeans and a purple t-shirt, her braided hair pulled back in a neat style. The other girl, slightly smaller, stood nearby, her attention focused on her phone screen. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, displaying a restless energy that made Zach's cop instincts tingle. He pulled the patrol car to a stop, positioning it at an angle that would block any attempt to run, a habit born from years of experience. The engine ticked as it cooled in the summer heat. Zach checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightened his badge, and opened his door. The heat hit him like a wall as he stepped out. His boots crunched on the gravel, and he automatically adjusted his utility belt, making sure everything was secure and within easy reach. The familiar weight of his gear provided a sense of authority as he approached the girls. The one with the phone glanced up at his approach, nudging her companion. There was something in their matching faces, twins, he realized, that spoke of good upbringing. Their clothes were nice, their appearances well kept. Still, experience had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. The taller girl, the one who'd been leaning against the wall, straightened up. There was a quiet strength in her bearing that Zach couldn't help but notice. Her sister, by contrast, seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, her fingers fidgeting with the phone case. Zach stopped about 10 feet away, maintaining what he considered a safe distance. The sun beat down on his back as he sized up the situation. The girls watched him with expressions he couldn't quite read, something between wariness and defiance. "Do you two live here?" he asked, using his official tone, firm but not yet aggressive. The girls exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation. The taller one spoke, her voice cool and controlled. "We're waiting for someone." Something about her tone, the slight edge of challenge in it, made Zach's jaw tighten. His hand moved instinctively toward his belt, resting near his equipment. Years of training and street experience had taught him to be ready for anything, even from teenagers who looked harmless enough. The younger girl's eyes tracked his hand movement, and he noticed her shift slightly closer to her sister. The air seemed to grow thicker with tension, despite the gentle rustle of oak leaves overhead and the distant chirp of cicadas. Zach takes another step forward, his boots crunching on the sun-baked gravel. The shade from the towering oak trees does little to cool the tension building in the air. "I need to see some ID," he demands, his voice carrying that authoritative edge he's perfected over 17 years on the force. Imani stands straighter, her chin lifting slightly. "Officer, we already told you, we're just waiting for our ride, we're not doing anything wrong." Amara shifts beside her sister, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her t-shirt. Her eyes dart between Zach and the street, searching for their ride. "That's not what I asked," Zach says, his jaw tightening. "Show me your identification. Now." "With all due respect," Imani replies, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We don't have to show ID without probable cause. What crime do you suspect us of committing?" Zach's face hardens. The question feels like a challenge to his authority, and he doesn't like it one bit. "Step away from the wall, both of you, hands where I can see them." Amara lets out a small whimper, tears welling up in her eyes. "Imani," she whispers, reaching for her phone in her back pocket. "Don't move," Zach barks, his hand instinctively moving to his belt. "Hands up. Now." Imani tries to keep her voice level, though fear creeps in at the edges. "Officer, please. We have rights. You can't just—" "1020 dispatch," Zach cuts her off, speaking into his shoulder radio. "Code 2. Possible trespassing. Subjects non-compliant." Everything happens fast after that. Amara's trembling fingers close around her phone, and Zach lunges forward, grabbing her wrist roughly. She cries out in pain and surprise. "Stop!" Imani shouts, taking a step forward. "You're hurting her." Zach twists Amara's arm behind her back, causing her to drop the phone with a clatter. She's sobbing now, her whole body shaking. "Please, please, we didn't do anything wrong." A car slows down on the street and someone holds up their phone, recording. Another person joins them, doing the same. "On your knees," Zach orders, already pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicks cold and tight around Amara's wrists as she continues to cry. Imani stands frozen, tears streaming down her face now too. "This isn't right," she says, her voice breaking. "We were just waiting." "Down! Now!" Zach reaches for her with his free hand, forcing her to her knees beside her sister. The second pair of handcuffs goes on just as tight. The girls kneel there on the hot pavement, Amara's sobs echoing off the brick walls, while Imani tries to whisper comfort to her sister. More cars are stopping now, more phones recording the scene. Zach's backup arrives, a transport vehicle. He roughly helps the girls to their feet, marching them toward his cruiser. They stumble along, Amara still crying, Imani trying to stay strong despite her own tears. He opens the back door and guides them in none too gently. The door slams with a heavy thud that makes both girls jump. Just then, his radio crackles to life. "Chief Rollins en route to precinct. ETA. 5 minutes." Zach pauses, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Then he slides into the driver's seat and pulls away from the curb, leaving behind a small crowd of witnesses with their phones still recording. The glass doors of Crestfield Police Precinct burst open, sending a ripple of tension through the lobby. Chief Desiree Rollins strode in, her casual clothes a stark contrast to her commanding presence. Her face was set in stone, eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Officer Riley, manning the front desk, straightened up instantly. The casual chatter around the precinct died as other officers noticed their chief's arrival. Even without her uniform, Desiree's authority filled the room like a thundercloud. "Where are my daughters?" Her voice cut through the silence. Riley's mouth opened and closed, his face draining of color. Sergeant Milton stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Chief, they're in holding." Desiree didn't wait for him to finish. She moved past the desk with purposeful strides, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Officers pressed themselves against the walls, avoiding eye contact. The holding area was dimly lit and smelled of industrial cleaner. Through the bars, Desiree saw them. Imani sitting straight-backed on the metal bench, her handcuffs glinting in the fluorescent light, while Amara huddled against her sister's shoulder. A dark bruise was forming on Amara's wrist where the cuffs had been too tight. "Mom!" Amara's voice cracked. The sight of her daughters, her babies, in handcuffs shattered Desiree's professional composure. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, throwing the cell door open. Amara fell into her arms, sobbing, while Imani stood slowly, her face a mask of controlled anger. "Who did this?" Desiree demanded, though she already knew. Her voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Where's the dashcam footage?" Milton appeared behind her. "Chief, maybe we should—" "Evidence room. Now." The words came out like bullets. The evidence room's viewing area was cramped, but officers kept filing in, drawn by the commotion. Desiree stood in front of the main monitor, her back rigid as Milton queued up the footage. The scene unfolded in harsh detail. Zach's aggressive approach, his dismissal of the girl's explanations, the way he grabbed Amara's phone. Every second made Desiree's jaw clench tighter. When Amara's cry of pain came through the speakers as Zach roughly cuffed her, several officers looked away. The footage ended. Desiree turned to face the room, her eyes sweeping across the gathered faces. "Arrest him." For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was thick enough to cut. "Chief," Milton started, "procedure dictates excessive force, unlawful detention, assault of a minor." Desiree's voice was deadly quiet. "Take your pick, Sergeant. But he's going in cuffs. Now." The door opened and Zach walked in, still adjusting his belt from the restroom. He froze when he saw the crowd, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. The footage paused on the screen, his chief's thunderous expression, his colleagues' averted gazes. "Chief Rollins, Hands behind your back, Officer Hill." Milton stepped forward, cuffs already out. Zach backed up, bumping into two officers who had moved to block the doorway. "Wait, this is ridiculous. I was responding to a call." "Those were my daughters," Desiree said, each word precise and cutting. The color drained from Zach's face as understanding dawned. "I didn't know they were your daughters," he stammered, as Milton secured the cuffs around his wrists. Desiree stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "That's not the defense you think it is." The holding cell door clanged shut with a metallic finality that made Zach flinch. He'd heard that sound thousands of times before, but never from this side of the bars. The familiar smell of disinfectant and stale air now seemed suffocating. Officer Riley stood at the booking desk, methodically filling out paperwork. His pen scratched against the forms with mechanical precision, never looking up. The silence was deafening. "Riley," Zach called out, gripping the cold metal bars. "Come on, man, you know me." Riley's pen paused for just a moment before continuing its steady march across the paper. The rejection in that small gesture hit Zach like a physical blow. He paced the small cell, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back. The concrete floor was worn smooth from countless other feet that had traced the same path. His police belt and badge sat in an evidence box on Riley's desk, stripped from him like his dignity. "This is crazy," Zach muttered, running his hands through his hair. "It was a routine stop. I followed procedure." Sergeant Milton appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You want to talk procedure, Hill? Let's talk about how you escalated a simple inquiry into an arrest without probable cause. Let's discuss why you didn't run their IDs or call it in properly." "They were being difficult," Zach protested, his voice rising. "The younger one reached for something." "Her phone," Milton cut him off. "We all saw the footage. A scared 14-year-old girl reached for her phone and you treated her like she was pulling a weapon." The words hit home, making Zach's stomach turn. He remembered the girl's cry of pain when he'd grabbed her wrist, the terror in her eyes. At the time, it had seemed justified, necessary even. Now, replaying it in his mind, he saw something different. "You have the right to remain silent," Milton recited, his voice dripping with irony. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar words echoed in Zach's head, taking on new meaning. How many times had he recited those same rights to others, watching their faces fall as the reality of their situation sank in? Now he understood that feeling, the cold weight of consequences settling in his gut. Riley finished the paperwork and filed it away without a word. The sound of the filing cabinet closing echoed through the holding area like a judge's gavel. Hours crawled by. Zach sat on the hard bench, then stood, then paced again. The afternoon light filtering through the high windows grew longer and dimmer. Other officers passed by, some averting their eyes, others staring with undisguised judgment. These were people he'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, backed up on dangerous calls. Now they looked at him like a stranger. Worse, like a criminal. The click of determined footsteps made him look up. Chief Rollins stood in the doorway, her presence filling the small space. She'd changed into her uniform, the brass on her collar catching the fluorescent light. Her face was composed now, but her eyes still burned. She stepped into the holding area, her movements deliberate. She didn't sit, didn't lean against the wall. She just stood there, studying him like she was seeing him for the first time. "Chief," Zach started, rising from the bench, "I want to apologize." "Stop talking." Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of authority he'd always admired, until it was directed at him. "I've watched that footage 7 times now. Each time I tried to see what you saw. What made you look at 2 teenage girls and see a threat?" Zach opened his mouth, then closed it. The rehearsed explanations died in his throat. "You arrested them like they didn't belong," she continued. "Like they weren't even human. You didn't just embarrass yourself. You exposed yourself." "I didn't know they were your daughters," he said weakly. "And that's exactly the problem." Her words cut through his defenses like a knife. "You saw 2 black girls outside a nice neighborhood, and you made assumptions. You didn't see them as someone's daughters, someone's sisters, someone's friends. You saw them as suspicious, as threats, as less than..." Each word landed like a blow. Zach felt the truth of them burning in his chest. "Chief, please," he tried again. "I never meant to..." But she was already turning away, her back straight and rigid. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving him alone with the weight of her words. Zach sank back onto the bench, the metal cold through his uniform pants. Above him, the security light buzzed and flickered, casting shifting shadows on the concrete floor. He lowered his head into his hands, the sound of that buzzing light the only company in his silence. The same light had flickered above countless others he'd put in this very cell. How many of them had he dismissed? How many times had he ignored their explanations, their fears, their humanity? The questions pressed down on him like physical weight as he sat there, head bowed in the growing darkness. The holding cell door clanged shut with a metallic finality that made Zach flinch. He'd been sitting there for hours now, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor as afternoon faded into evening. The familiar sounds of the precinct, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, doors opening and closing, felt different from this side of the bars. At 8 p.m., a surge of voices from the booking area caught his attention. Officer Riley, who had been quietly doing paperwork at her desk, turned up the volume on the small TV mounted in the corner. The familiar jingle of the local news filled the air. "Breaking news tonight." A reporter in a navy blazer stood outside the precinct, her microphone gripped tightly as red and blue lights flashed behind her. "A white police officer has been arrested after detaining the twin daughters of Chief Desiree Rollins outside a gated community this afternoon." Zach's stomach lurched. He stood up, moving closer to the bars to get a better view of the screen. The story cut to dashcam footage, his dashcam footage. He watched himself approach the girls, his stance aggressive, hand hovering near his weapon. The audio was crystal clear. "Step away from the wall. Hands where I can see them." "Oh God," he whispered, watching himself grab Amara's wrist. The footage had been edited to emphasize the moment, showing it from multiple angles, including shaky cell phone videos from bystanders. One clip focused on Amara's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as the handcuffs clicked into place. The reporter's voice continued over the footage. "Sources say the officer, identified as Zachary Hill, failed to verify the teenagers' identities before escalating to physical force. The girls were waiting for their mother, Police Chief Desiree Rollins, at the time of the incident." Social media posts began flashing across the screen. Twitter hashtags scrolled by. Crestfield twins, arrested while black, cop booked. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. His photo, his official department headshot, appeared next to the viral videos. "Hey Riley," Zach called out, his voice hoarse. "Can you check my phone? There must be some messages from the union rep." Officer Riley glanced at his sealed evidence bag on her desk, the phone inside lighting up every few seconds with new notifications. She shook her head. "You should stop watching," she said quietly. "This is only the beginning." But he couldn't look away. The news coverage switched to a panel discussion, faces he recognized from national media outlets debating his actions. "The question we need to ask," one commentator said, leaning forward intently, "was this racism or just another day in America?" Zach's legs felt weak. He stumbled back to the bench, but the words followed him. Racism. The charge hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. He'd never considered himself racist. He'd always said he treated everyone the same. But now, watching the footage played over and over, he saw what everyone else saw. A white cop roughing up two black teenage girls who had done nothing wrong. Officers walked past his cell, their eyes averted. These were people he'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, backed up on dangerous calls. Now they hurried past, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly when they noticed him watching. The TV switched to another reporter, this one standing in front of the gated community. "Residents say this isn't the first time police have been called about suspicious individuals in the area. Civil rights activists are calling for a full investigation into racial profiling practices." His phone lit up again in the evidence bag. The screen showed dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and endless news alerts. Each notification represented another person learning about what he'd done, another judgment being made. The footage played again, and again. Each time, he noticed something new. The fear in Amara's eyes, the quiet dignity in Imani's resistance, the way his own face hardened with assumed authority. The commentary continued, dissecting every moment, every movement, every word. "Local activists are gathering outside the precinct," a reporter announced. The camera panned to show a growing crowd with signs and megaphones. "They're demanding accountability and systemic change." Officer Riley stood up, walking to the window to peer through the blinds. "Media trucks are starting to line up," she said, more to herself than to Zach. "Chief's going to have her hands full with this one." On screen, the news ticker scrolled steadily. Former Officer Zach Hill may face internal charges and public disciplinary action. The word "former" hit him like a physical blow. He slowly lowered himself to the bench in the cell, the glow of the television reflecting on the wall behind him. This was real. This wasn't going away. His career, his reputation, his whole life, everything was changing in real time, broadcast for the world to see. And he was forced to watch it all unfold from behind bars, powerless to stop it, unable to hide from the truth of his actions played out on endless repeat. The side door of the precinct creaked open into the gray morning light. Zach stepped out, squinting at the dim sunrise. His lawyer, a stern-faced woman in a navy suit, walked slightly ahead of him, clearing the path. The clothes he'd worn yesterday felt stiff and uncomfortable after a night in holding. "Keep your head down and walk straight to my car," his lawyer said in a clipped tone. "Don't speak to anyone." Through the chain-link fence that separated the employee parking lot from the main street, Zach could hear the commotion of reporters gathered at the front entrance. Camera flashes popped like lightning against the building's brick walls. His stomach churned. The walk to the car felt endless. Each step on the cracked pavement reminded him of what he'd lost. His badge, his gun, his uniform, all surrendered and logged into evidence less than an hour ago. He'd watched silently as Officer Riley sealed them in plastic bags, her face carefully blank as she avoided his eyes. Inside his lawyer's car, the leather seats felt too soft, too normal. Zach stared at his hands, rough and empty without his usual gear. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that now seemed foreign. "Shower, change, be at City Hall by 9:45, his lawyer instructed as she dropped him off. "And Zach? Don't talk to anyone. Not your colleagues, not the press. No one." His house felt like a stranger's. Zach moved through it like a ghost, barely recognizing his own belongings. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection startled him. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, stubble roughening his jaw. He looked older, defeated. The hot water of the shower didn't wash away the weight in his chest. Each breath felt heavy with the reality of what was happening. His mind kept replaying Chief Rollins' words. "You exposed yourself." By 9:45 a.m., Zach sat rigid in a hard wooden chair outside the hearing room at City Hall. The hallway's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the marble floor. His fresh suit felt like armor, but offered no real protection. At exactly 10 a.m., double doors opened. 3 Internal Affairs Board members filed in, 2 men and a woman, all wearing expressions carved from stone. A clerk sat to the side, a tower of manila folders stacked before her. Officer Zachary Hill, the woman at the center of the panel, began. "This emergency hearing will address the events of yesterday afternoon, as well as review your complete service record with the Crestfield Police Department." Zach's throat went dry. His lawyer touched his arm, a warning to stay quiet. "Clerk, please read the documented incidents," the woman continued. The clerk's voice filled the room, each word falling like a hammer. 5 separate profiling complaints filed between 2019 and 2023. 2 excessive force incidents documented in 2020 and 2022. 3 formal warnings regarding inappropriate tone and failure to follow de-escalation protocols, dated March 2021, September 2022, and January 2023. Zach's head spun. He remembered each incident vaguely, but he'd dismissed them all. Just people making trouble, he'd thought, just part of the job. "Would you like to address these previous incidents?" the older Blackboard member asked, his deep voice resonating with barely contained anger. Zach leaned forward, words tumbling out before his lawyer could stop him. "I was just doing what I was trained to do, following protocol -. "And that's exactly the problem." The board member cut him off, his words sharp enough to make Zach flinch. His lawyer's hand gripped his arm. "My client declines to comment further at this time." The hearing continued, mechanical and merciless. Each complaint was read in detail, each warning explained, each incident examined under the harsh light of hindsight. Zach sat there, feeling smaller by the minute as his career unraveled before him. He'd never really listened before, never really heard the fear in the voices of those who'd filed complaints. Never really saw the pattern forming, incident by incident, year after year. The woman at the center spoke again. "Officer Hill, this board finds a disturbing pattern of behavior that culminated in yesterday's inexcusable treatment of 2 minor citizens of this community." When the hearing ended, Zach's legs felt wooden as he stood. The hallway outside was packed with reporters, cameras ready, microphones thrust forward like weapons. His lawyer guided him through the crowd, her arm a shield against the barrage of questions. Inside his suit jacket, Zach's hands trembled. The flashing lights felt like accusations. Each shouted question hammered home the reality of what he'd become. He kept his head down, said nothing, and walked through the gauntlet of cameras and microphones. His hands stayed buried in his coat pockets, shaking with the weight of everything he'd failed to see until now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of City Hall as Zach made his way down the quiet corridor. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors, each step feeling heavier than the last. The summons from Chief Rollins had arrived an hour ago, a simple white envelope that made his hands shake when he opened it. The conference room door loomed ahead. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a single figure sitting at the table. Zach took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, civilian clothes now, no uniform, and knocked softly. "Come in," Chief Rollins' voice commanded from inside. The room felt smaller than he remembered. Chief Rollins sat at the far end of the long table, her attention focused on a thick report spread out before her. She didn't look up as Zach entered, didn't acknowledge him beyond a slight gesture toward the chair across from her. Zach lowered himself into the seat, trying to control his breathing. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional rustle of paper as Chief Rollins turned another page. Her face remained unreadable as her eyes moved methodically across each line. Minutes ticked by on the wall clock. Zach's collar felt too tight. Sweat beaded at his temples. Still, Chief Rollins read, and still, he waited. Finally, she looked up, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to shrink back into his chair. "I dropped the criminal charges," and the words hung in the air. Zach felt his shoulders sag with relief, a breath he didn't know he was holding rushing out of his lungs. But don't confuse that for forgiveness. His relief evaporated instantly. Chief Rollins leaned forward, folding her hands on top of the report. "You're wondering why?" she continued, her voice steady and measured. "Why drop the charges when we both know what the dashcam footage shows, when there are dozens of civilian videos circulating online?" Zach nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. "Because the court of public opinion is already serving a harsher sentence than any judge could hand down. Your face is everywhere, Officer Hill. Your actions are being dissected on national news. Your career?" She shook her head. "That's over. We both know it." The truth of her words stung, but Zach couldn't argue. He'd seen the coverage, read the comments, watched his life unravel in real time across social media. "However," Chief Rollins continued, "I'm offering you something unexpected, something you don't deserve, but my daughters might need." She paused, studying his face. "You want to fix this? Then don't talk to me, talk to them." Zach blinked, confusion crossing his features. "I don't understand." "A private reconciliation process. You, Imani, and Amara. No cameras, no press, no carefully crafted statements from your lawyer. Just you, facing the consequences of your actions through their eyes." Zach's voice faltered. The thought of facing the girls made his stomach twist. "What would I even say?" "They don't want your apology," Chief Rollins cut in sharply. "They want your truth. They want to know why you saw two teenage girls waiting for their mother and immediately assumed the worst. They want to understand how you could look at them and see threats instead of children." She stood up, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "This isn't about saving your career or your reputation. This is about my daughters getting the closure they deserve. About them seeing you as a human being who made terrible choices, not just another faceless symbol of everything they've been taught to fear." Zach sat there, words failing him. The magnitude of what she was proposing settled over him like a heavy blanket. "Think carefully before you answer," Chief Rollins advised. "This won't be easy. They're angry, they're hurt, and they have every right to be. If you're not ready to face that, really face it, then walk away now." She moved toward the door, then paused. "But remember this, sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need most." Zach remained seated as she left, the door closing softly behind her. His mind raced with possibilities, with fears, with the weight of what was being asked of him. After several long moments, he rose on unsteady legs and made his way out of the conference room. Outside, the late afternoon sun was harsh against his eyes. He stood alone on the sidewalk, squinting at his reflection in the glass doors of City Hall. The man staring back at him looked foreign, shoulders slumped, face drawn, eyes haunted. A stranger wearing his face carrying the burden of choices he couldn't undo. Zach's hand trembled slightly as he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the conference room. The space felt impossibly small. Just a folding table, 3 chairs, and a pitcher of water with plastic cups lined up like soldiers. The bare walls seemed to close in around him, their institutional beige color offering no comfort. A security guard stood by the door, his expression neutral but watchful. He gave Zach a brief nod before stepping outside, the soft click of the door echoing in the silent room. Zach tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt. Civilian clothes felt strange after years in uniform. He paced the length of the room, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. The events of the past few days played through his mind like a broken record. The arrest, the holding cell, the news coverage, Chief Rollins' words. The pitcher of water caught his attention. His throat felt dry, but his hands shook too much to pour without spilling. Instead, he lowered himself into one of the metal chairs, the legs scraping against the floor. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, 5, then 10, then 15. Each second stretched like an hour. The door opened. Imani entered first, her chin held high, shoulders squared. She wore a simple blue t-shirt and jeans, but carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown that day at the gate. Behind her, Amara shuffled in, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes darted around the room, looking everywhere but at Zach. The girls took their seats across the table. Imani's gaze locked onto Zach, unflinching. Amara's chair was angled slightly away, her body language screaming discomfort. "Say your name," Imani's voice cut through the silence. "Say what you did." Zach's mouth went dry. He cleared his throat. I'm Zach Hill, and We know who you are," Imani interrupted. "Say what you did." "I was responding to a call about suspicious activity," he began. "No." Imani's voice was sharp. "We didn't come here for a lecture about police procedure." Zach shifted in his chair. The rehearsed explanations died in his throat. Amara's shoulders tensed at his movement, and he noticed a fading bruise on her wrist, where his handcuffs had been. He tried again. "I made assumptions. I didn't listen when you tried to explain." "Assumptions?" Imani's eyebrows raised. "Is that what you call it when you grab a 14-year-old girl? When you put handcuffs on teenagers waiting for their mother?" Amara's fingers traced the bruise on her wrist. She still hadn't looked at him. "I'm sorry," Zach said, the words feeling hollow even as they left his mouth. "I didn't know." "That we were the chief's daughters," Imani finished. "Would it have mattered if we weren't?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Zach opened his mouth, then closed it again. Every explanation felt like an excuse. Every word felt inadequate. "I saw the news coverage," he tried. "The social media posts. I understand now how it looked." "How it looked?" Imani's voice was quiet but sharp. "We're not here to talk about how it looked. We're here to talk about how it felt." Amara shifted in her chair, pulling her sleeves down over her hands. Her eyes remained fixed on the table. "I was doing my job," Zach said weakly. "Your job was to protect people," Imani responded. "Did we look like we needed protecting? Or did we look like something else to you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He remembered his thoughts that day, the assumptions he'd made before he even stepped out of his patrol car, the way he'd positioned his hand near his weapon, the tone he'd used. "I want you to say exactly what you did," Imani pressed. "Not what you were trained to do, not what the call said. What you did to us." Zach's throat felt tight. I profiled you. I saw 2 black teenagers at a gate, and I decided you didn't belong there. I didn't ask who you were waiting for. I didn't check your story. I assumed." The words hung heavy in the air. Amara's fingers continued to trace the bruise on her wrist. "And then?" Imani prompted. "Then I escalated the situation. I grabbed Amara when she reached for her phone. I used force when there was no threat. I put you both in handcuffs without cause." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. The reality of his actions, stripped of justification and procedure, felt raw and ugly in the sterile conference room. Imani pushed her chair back and stood. The legs scraped against the floor, making Amara flinch. She rose too, following her sister's lead. As they turned toward the door, Amara finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she didn't turn to face him. "I thought I was going to die." The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Zach alone with the weight of those words. The morning sun filtered through the conference room's blinds, casting thin stripes of light across the plain folding table. Zach Hill sat alone, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent replaying that fateful afternoon over and over in his mind. The water pitcher sat untouched, just like yesterday, drops of condensation sliding down its sides. His fingers drummed nervously on the table's surface. The hollow sound echoed in the empty room. He'd arrived early, hoping to gather his thoughts, but his mind kept wandering back to Amara's parting words from yesterday. "I thought I was going to die." The door opened with a soft click. Zach's head snapped up as Imani and Amara walked in. The girls moved cautiously, like deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Imani's face was set in determined lines, while Amara hung slightly behind her sister, arms wrapped protectively around herself. Imani pulled out a chair, the legs scraping against the floor. The sound made Amara flinch. The younger girl slowly lowered herself into the seat beside her sister, keeping her eyes fixed on the table. "If you came to make excuses," Imani said, her voice clear and firm, "don't waste our time." Zach cleared his throat. I didn't. He paused, trying to find the right words. "I was just responding to a call." "Stop." Imani's hand cut through the air. Her eyes blazed. "You knew we were black, and that was enough." The words hit Zach like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, but the truth of her statement silenced him. He remembered how quickly he'd made assumptions, how easily he'd dismissed their explanations. "I heard the dashcam audio," Imani continued. "Your voice, the way you spoke to us, the moment we questioned anything, you got aggressive." She leaned forward. "Why was that, Officer Hill?" Zach shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I was trained to maintain control of situations." "Control?" Imani's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Is that what you call throwing a 14-year-old girl against a wall?" Beside her, Amara's shoulders tensed. She hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes were now fixed on Zach, watching his every move. "I'm sorry," Zach said, the words feeling inadequate even as they left his mouth. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Imani pressed. "Didn't mean to assume we were criminals? Didn't mean to ignore our rights? Didn't mean to traumatize my sister?" Zach's throat felt tight. He reached for the water pitcher, but his hand stopped midway. He didn't deserve the relief. "Do you know what it feels like?" Amara's soft voice suddenly filled the room. "To have your wrists zip-tied while your sister begs a cop to stop hurting you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Zach couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't look away from Amara's face, which held such raw pain it made his chest ache. Amara stood up slowly, her chair squeaking against the floor. Imani followed immediately, protective as always. They moved toward the door together, leaving Zach sitting alone with the weight of Amara's question. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the empty room. Zach leaned forward, putting his elbows on the table. His eyes stung as Amara's earlier words played on repeat in his mind. "I thought I was going to die." He stared at his reflection in the water pitcher, distorted and wavering, just like everything he thought he knew about himself. The key in Zach's lock turned with a hollow click, echoing through the empty hallway of his apartment building. Inside, darkness greeted him, broken only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through half-drawn blinds. The familiar hum of his refrigerator filled the silence as he dropped his keys onto the small table by the door, the metallic clatter making him wince. A stack of mail had accumulated over the past few days, white envelopes piled high, some marked urgent in bold red letters. Zach walked past them without a second glance. His footsteps felt heavy as he made his way to the living room couch, the fabric squeaking beneath his weight as he sank into it. The apartment looked different now, bare, empty. The walls that had once displayed his achievements stood naked, the slightly darker patches of paint marking where his commendations had hung. The glass display case that had housed his badge sat open and hollow on the shelf, like a tiny coffin. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. He'd been avoiding it all day. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, there was nothing left to distract him. With trembling fingers, he pulled it out and pressed the power button. The screen lit up his face in the dim room, casting harsh shadows. 18 missed calls, 37 unread texts. The notifications scrolled endlessly. Local news stations requesting comments. Unknown numbers leaving voicemails he couldn't bring himself to listen to. Former colleagues sending messages that ranged from cautionary to condemning. "Lay low for a while, Hill. This'll blow over. You really messed up this time. Can't believe you did this to us, to the badge." His thumb hovered over a social media app icon. He knew he shouldn't open it. Knew nothing good waited for him there. But like a man unable to look away from a car crash, He tapped it anyway. The video was the first thing he saw. Someone had edited the bystander footage together with his dashcam audio. The scene played out in brutal clarity. His harsh voice, Amara's terrified face, the way he grabbed her wrist as she reached for her phone. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut mixed with her sobs. The comments below the video made his stomach turn. Racist cop finally caught. This is what they do when cameras aren't rolling. Look at how scared that poor girl is. Hope he never wears a badge again. Zach closed the app with shaking hands, but the images stayed burned in his mind. The phone slipped from his fingers onto the couch cushion beside him, its screen still casting an accusatory glow. He pushed himself up, legs unsteady, and walked over to his desk. The surface was mostly clear now. He'd packed away most of his police memorabilia after the incident, but one frame remained, his academy graduation photo. Young Zach smiled back at him, proud in his crisp new uniform, eyes bright with purpose and possibility. He remembered that day clearly, how his chest had swelled with pride when they pinned on his badge, how certain he'd been about his path, about protecting and serving, how his father, a retired officer himself, had clapped him on the back and welcomed him to the family. Now that same photo seemed to mock him. The young officer in the picture looked like a stranger, naive, unaware of the weight his uniform would carry, the damage his assumptions would cause, unaware that one day he'd be the threat people needed protection from. His hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out to touch the frame. For a moment, he just stood there, fingers pressed against the glass, feeling the cold surface against his skin. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned the frame face down. The soft thud it made against the desk felt like a door closing. The darkness in the apartment had deepened, but Zach didn't bother turning on any lights. He made his way back to the couch and lay down, still fully dressed in the clothes he'd worn to the reconciliation meeting. The ceiling above him was barely visible in the gloom, just a darker shade of black against the night. His chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on it. The silence of the apartment pressed in around him, broken only by the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. In that quiet, dark space, the question that had been building all day finally escaped his lips in a whisper. What if they're right? The words hung in the air, unanswered. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove past, and Zach lay there in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of his former life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile conference room as Zach settled into the now familiar metal chair. 5 days had passed since his last attempt at reconciliation, each hour weighing on him like stones in his pockets. His hands rested on the table, fingers loosely linked, no longer carrying the defensive tension from before. The door opened with a soft click. Imani entered first, her shoulders straight but less rigid than previous meetings. Amara followed, her eyes fixed on the floor tiles. They moved with measured steps, maintaining their distance as they approached the table. The air felt thick with unspoken words. Imani took her seat, placing her phone on the table with deliberate care. Her expression was calm but determined as she looked directly at Zach. Without preamble or greeting, she pressed play. The audio crackled through the phone's speaker, filling the small room with echoes of that day. Zach's voice boomed out, harsh and commanding. "Step away from the wall now. Hands where I can see them." The volume was startling, aggressive, authoritative, threatening. Zach felt his stomach twist as he heard himself bark orders, each word dripping with barely contained anger. The trembling voice of Amara begging him to stop made his chest tighten. "This is what you sound like when you're scared of us," Imani said, her voice steady but sharp. She watched his face, noting every flinch, every moment of recognition. Zach opened his mouth, the beginning of an apology forming on his lips. Don't, Imani cut him off, raising her hand. "We don't need another apology. What we need is for you to really hear yourself." She leaned forward slightly. "How many times have you used that exact same voice with other kids who looked like us?" Zach started automatically. "Doing your job?" Imani's words carried a weight that seemed to press him back in his chair. "Then your job is broken." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He remembered other stops, other encounters. How many times had he used that same tone? How many children had he terrified, thinking he was simply maintaining authority? Amara's soft voice broke through his thoughts, barely above a whisper but impossible to ignore. "You sound like every officer in the stories our mom used to warn us about." The words settled in the room like dust after an explosion. Zach didn't try to defend himself this time. He didn't reach for explanations or justifications. Instead, he listened, really listened. Perhaps for the first time since this all began. He heard the fear beneath Amara's quiet words, the weight of generations of warnings passed from parent to child. He heard the exhaustion in Imani's voice, the burden of having to explain something so fundamental to someone who should have known better. The recording played again in his mind, his voice transformed by fear and prejudice into something monstrous. He saw himself through their eyes, not as the professional he'd always imagined himself to be, but as the threat their mother had warned them about. Minutes passed in heavy silence. The fluorescent lights continued their endless hum. Outside, life went on as usual, but in this room, something was shifting, breaking down, rebuilding. Finally, Zach spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize how I sounded. Until now." Imani stood up without another word, gathering her phone and pushing in her chair. The legs scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the quiet room. As she headed for the door, Amara lingered for just a moment longer. She turned slightly toward Zach, though her eyes remained fixed somewhere in the middle distance. "We didn't either," she said softly, "until it was too late." The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly as Zach pushed open the heavy door of the reconciliation room. His steps faltered immediately. There, in the far corner, sat Chief Desiree Rollins. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her expression impossible to read. Imani and Amara sat at the table, their backs straight, faces turned toward him with a mix of wariness and expectation. The silence in the room felt thick enough to touch. Zach's throat went dry as he made his way to his usual chair, the scrape of its legs against the floor unnaturally loud. His palms were sweating. He hadn't expected Chief Rollins to be here today. He started, then stopped. His eyes kept darting to the corner where Chief Rollins sat, still as a statue. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through him. Zach took a shaky breath and tried again. "I've been thinking a lot about where it all started." His voice came out rough, uncertain. "About growing up in Oak Ridge where—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Where people who looked like you were always seen as trouble." Imani's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she remained silent. Amara's fingers twisted in her lap. "My dad was a cop too," Zach continued, his voice growing quieter. "Every night at dinner he'd tell stories about his patrols, about the bad neighborhoods, about who to watch out for." He stared down at his hands on the table. "Nobody ever questioned it. Not my teachers, not our neighbors, not me." The air conditioning hummed in the background as Zach forced himself to look up at the girls. "I didn't wake up wanting to see you as a threat," he said, his voice beginning to shake. "But I didn't stop it either. And that's on me." A single tear rolled down Amara's cheek, catching the harsh fluorescent light. She quickly wiped it away, but Zach had seen it. His words caught in his throat, and suddenly he couldn't continue. The weight of everything, his upbringing, his assumptions, the damage he'd done, crashed over him like a wave. Chief Rollins hadn't moved from her corner, hadn't made a sound, but her presence made every word feel more significant, every admission more real. Zach tried to steady his breathing, but emotion kept building in his chest. His vision blurred as he fought back tears. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was trained to protect people." He had to stop, swallow hard. "But no one taught me how to see them first." The silence stretched for several long seconds before Chief Rollins finally spoke from her corner. "Then maybe now's the time to start learning." The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the empty reconciliation room as Zach sat alone, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. His fingers wouldn't stop fidgeting. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 11:30 a.m. Every minute felt like an hour. The door's hinges creaked softly as it opened. Zach's heart jumped, but he kept his eyes fixed on his hands. Familiar footsteps entered. Lighter ones, younger ones. No authoritative click of Chief Rollins's heels today. Just the twins. Amara slipped into her chair without looking at him, her shoulders tight with tension. Imani moved with deliberate slowness, pulling out her chair and settling in with the kind of careful precision that spoke of uncertainty. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. "Thank you for coming back," Zach said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He meant it, really meant it, but the words felt small in the vastness of what lay between them. The air conditioning hummed. Someone's phone buzzed quietly in a pocket. Outside, a car horn honked in the distance. The mundane sounds only highlighted the weight of what wasn't being said. Then Amara spoke. "I had nightmares for a week." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. No tears, no trembling. Just a simple statement of truth. She still wouldn't look at him directly, her eyes fixed on some point just past his shoulder. But she'd spoken to him. Really spoken to him. For the first time since that day. Zach's throat tightened. Words rose up, explanations, apologies, defenses. But he forced them back down. What could he possibly say to that? What words could erase the terror he'd planted in a 14-year-old girl's mind? He watched her hands folded carefully in her lap and remembered how they'd trembled when he'd grabbed her wrist. The silence stretched again, heavy with unspoken pain. "What made you pull out the cuffs so fast?" Imani's question cut through the quiet like a knife. Her voice wasn't angry or accusatory, just curious, almost clinical. But her eyes were sharp, watching his face for any hint of deflection or dishonesty. Zach felt the familiar urge to defend himself rise up, to cite protocol, to mention the dispatch call, to explain about proper procedure. But for the first time, he pushed past those rehearsed responses and really thought about her question. Why had he escalated so quickly? What had driven him to reach for those handcuffs instead of just talking? The truth, when it came, surprised even him. "Because I was afraid of what people would say if I didn't." The words hung in the air between them. They weren't pretty or polished. They weren't even really an excuse. They were just honest, raw, real. Something shifted in the room, subtle but unmistakable. Amara's shoulders relaxed slightly. Imani's gaze softened, just a fraction. Nothing was fixed or forgotten, but something had changed. Amara glanced at her sister, a silent communication passing between them. "Let's go," she said quietly, pushing back from the table. They stood together, gathering their things with the same careful movements they'd arrived with. But at the door, Amara paused. She turned back, and for the first time that day, her eyes met Zach's directly. "That's the first real thing you've said," she said softly, and then they were gone, leaving Zach alone with that truth. The morning sun filtered through the thin blinds of the reconciliation room, casting strips of light across the folding table. At exactly 10 a.m., the familiar scene played out again, but something felt different this time. The tension that usually crackled in the air had softened slightly, like a storm cloud that wasn't quite ready to break. Zach sat straighter in his chair, his shoulders set with purpose rather than defense. When Imani and Amara entered, they took their seats with the same careful distance, but their expressions held something new, a hint of curiosity mixed with their usual guardedness. Before either girl could speak, Zach cleared his throat. His voice came out quieter than usual, but steady. "If I can ask for anything, it's not forgiveness, just a few minutes to tell you the truth about me." Imani's eyebrows lifted slightly. She exchanged a quick glance with Amara, who kept her eyes fixed on her lap, but gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I grew up in East Ridge," Zach began, his hands flat on the table. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone looked like me. Blue-collar families mostly. Police officers, factory workers, mechanics." He paused, swallowing hard. "My dad was a cop. Third generation, the kind of man who saw everything in black and white. Good guys and bad guys. There wasn't much room for anything in between. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Zach continued, his voice growing softer but more certain with each word. When I was 12, my uncle got hurt bad in a robbery. The kid who did it was black, probably not much older than you, Imani. He looked at her directly, then quickly away. That story, it became like family legend. Every holiday, every gathering, someone would bring it up. The details got worse every time. The fear got bigger, the anger deeper. Amara's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, but she didn't move. Imani's face remained carefully neutral, though her eyes never left Zach's face. Nobody ever sat us down and said it was okay to be racist, Zach continued, his voice thick with emotion. But they didn't say it wasn't either. It was just there, in the way people talked, the jokes they told, the neighborhoods they warned us about. He ran a hand across his face, looking suddenly older in the harsh lighting. I'm not telling you this to make excuses. What I did to you both, that's on me. But I need you to understand where it started, how deep it goes. The room fell silent except for the steady hum of the air conditioning. Zach's words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of inherited fear and unexamined beliefs. When I joined the force, he continued, I thought I was different from my dad. More progressive, I guess. But fear, it's like a seed that grows roots before you even know it's there. And when I saw you both at that gate, he trailed off, shaking his head. Amara lifted her eyes for the first time, studying Zach's face as if seeing something new there. Imani sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. The training reinforced everything I'd already learned at home, Zach admitted. Be alert, trust your instincts, watch for threats. But nobody ever talked about how those instincts get shaped in the first place. How fear becomes a reflex you don't even question anymore. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not that 12-year-old kid anymore listening to stories about bad people who look different from me. I'm not that rookie cop thinking I knew better than my old man. I'm someone who's finally seeing how wrong we all were. How wrong I was. The silence that followed felt different from their previous meetings. Less like a wall and more like a bridge, shaky and uncertain. But there. Imani straightened in her chair, her dark eyes fixed on Zach with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he didn't. He held her gaze, letting her see whatever truth she was searching for in his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured and clear. Understanding where it came from doesn't make it okay, but at least now, we see what we're up against. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the reconciliation room's blinds as Zach settled into his usual chair. His hands trembled slightly as he placed a crisp, typed statement on the table in front of him. The paper represented hours of careful writing, editing, and rehearsing, but something about its polished surface felt wrong now. When Imani and Amara entered, their footsteps echoing in the quiet room, Zach found himself reaching for the paper. But instead of reading it, he slowly folded it in half and set it aside. The practiced words suddenly seemed hollow compared to the weight in his chest. Yesterday you asked why I cuffed you so fast, he began, his voice rougher than usual. Today I'm ready to admit the real answer. Imani's posture stiffened slightly, while Amara's fingers curled around the edge of her chair. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, filling the silence between his words. Zach took a deep breath, forcing himself to look directly at both girls. I didn't see two kids. I saw suspects. His voice cracked on the last word. And that shame belongs to me. The admission hung heavy in the air. Neither girl spoke, but their attention was focused entirely on him now. Zach could feel the weight of their gaze, but for once, he didn't try to deflect it. I told myself I was following protocol, he continued, his words coming faster now, as if breaking through a dam, that I was maintaining control of the situation. But that's not what was really happening. He ran a hand across his face, wiping away the sweat that had begun to bead on his forehead. I confused fear for authority, he admitted. I used protocol as a shield because it was easier than questioning why I immediately saw you as threats, why I needed to assert control before I even knew who you were." Amara shifted in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "You made me feel like I was already guilty." Her eyes, usually averted, met his directly. Like I wasn't even allowed to speak. Zach felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. He nodded slowly, fighting the urge to look away. "And I made myself believe I was doing the right thing," he said. "Because I didn't want to face the truth. I didn't see you." His voice broke then, and tears welled up in his eyes. In previous sessions, he might have turned away or tried to compose himself. This time, he let the tears fall, keeping his face turned toward the girls. Let them see what this truth was costing him. Let them see him stripped of his authority, his defenses, his practiced explanations. "I didn't see two sisters waiting for their mother," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see your fear when I approached. I didn't hear the truth in your words when you tried to explain. I saw what I was trained to see, what I allowed myself to see." Imani's hands, folded tightly in her lap, loosened slightly. Her expression remained guarded, but something in her eyes had softened. Not with forgiveness, but with recognition of his raw honesty. "Every time I put those cuffs on someone," Zach said, "I told myself I was protecting the community. But I never stopped to ask which community I was really protecting, or who I was really afraid of." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand but didn't try to hide the tremor in his voice. "When I heard Chief Rollins was your mother, my first thought wasn't about how badly I'd hurt you. It was about how much trouble I was in. That's the kind of person I had become, someone who cared more about consequences than casualties." Amara's breath caught audibly at this admission. Even Imani seemed to lean forward slightly, caught by the brutal honesty of his words. "I can't undo what I did," Zach continued. "I can't erase the fear I caused or the trust I broke. I can't even promise that other officers won't do the same thing tomorrow, or the next day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I can sit here and tell you the absolute truth. I was wrong. Not just in what I did, but in who I allowed myself to become." The silence that followed felt different from their previous meetings, less like a wall between them and more like a shared space of understanding, however painful. Zach straightened in his chair, his voice steadier now but still raw with emotion. "I'm not asking for anything today. Not your forgiveness. Not your understanding. Just the chance to keep listening if you'll let me." For the first time since these sessions began, Imani didn't immediately stand to leave. Instead, she remained seated, her dark eyes fixed on Zach's face, studying him with an intensity that seemed to see past all his remaining defenses. The afternoon sun slanted through Zach's kitchen window as his phone buzzed with a text. He nearly dropped it when he read the message from the unknown number. "Can you be at the city boardroom tomorrow at 10 a.m.? We're speaking. You should hear it." No signature needed. The directness, the quiet authority, it could only be from Imani. His throat tightened as he typed and deleted several responses before simply sending, "I'll be there." That evening, Zach paced his apartment, running his fingers through his graying hair. He'd seen the notice about the Oversight board meeting in the local paper but hadn't planned to attend. Now, sitting at his kitchen table under the harsh overhead light, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. His hand shook slightly as he put down thoughts that had been churning inside him since those reconciliation meetings. He wasn't sure if he'd be asked to speak, probably not, but something told him to be prepared. The words came slowly at first, then faster as he let his guard down. 2 hours and several crumpled attempts later, he had something that felt honest. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He tossed and turned, remembering the sound of handcuffs clicking, Amara's tears, Imani's steady gaze. The memory of his own voice on those recordings still made him wince. Morning arrived with a gray drizzle that matched his mood. Zach chose his clothes carefully. No uniform anymore, of course, but he selected a dark blue suit that felt appropriately serious without seeming defensive. His hands trembled slightly as he knotted his tie. The drive to City Hall took longer than usual. Traffic was heavy, and Zach found himself gripping the steering wheel too tightly at each red light. He arrived at 9:50 a.m., parallel parking a block away. The walk to the building entrance felt endless. A simple printed sign stood on an easel outside the main doors. Oversight Board, Public Testimony on Police Bias. Zach's steps slowed as he approached it, the reality of what he was about to witness settling heavily on his shoulders. Inside, the boardroom was already filling up. Journalists clustered near the walls, their cameras ready. Community members occupied most seats, their expressions ranging from concerned to angry. A row of serious-faced board members sat behind a long table at the front, shuffling through papers and speaking in low voices. Zach spotted Imani and Amara immediately. They sat in the front row, both wearing conservative dark dresses that made them look older than their years. Imani's back was straight as always, her expression composed but determined. Amara fidgeted slightly with the hem of her sleeve, but her chin was lifted with quiet dignity. A few seats away from them sat Chief Rollins, dressed in civilian clothes but radiating the same commanding presence she always had. She didn't look around the room, didn't acknowledge anyone. Her focus remained steadily forward, supporting her daughters with her presence while letting them own this moment. Zach slipped into a seat in the back row, trying to make himself inconspicuous. A few people glanced his way. His face had been in the news enough lately that some recognition was inevitable. But most attention remained focused on the front of the room, where the board chairman was preparing to call the meeting to order. The folded paper in Zach's pocket felt heavy, though he knew it contained only a few hundred words. He touched it briefly, then forced his hand back to his lap. This wasn't his moment to speak. He was here to listen, really listen the way he should have done that day at the gates of Willow Heights. A hush fell over the room as the chairman tapped his microphone. Zach watched Imani and Amara stand in perfect unison, smoothing their skirts as they moved toward the podium. His heart pounded as they took their places, and he found himself gripping the paper in his pocket, not to pull it out, but to ground himself in this moment. The sisters stood together at the microphone, their shoulders nearly touching. Even from the back of the room, Zach could see the slight tremor in Amara's hands, the way Imani shifted just a fraction closer to her sister. But their faces showed no fear, no hesitation. They were ready to tell their story. The chairman cleared his throat. The board recognizes Imani and Amara Rollins for their testimony regarding the events of July 15th and their broader implications for police reform in our community. Zach's fingers tightened around the paper in his pocket, but he remained absolutely still. He wasn't here to defend himself or offer explanations. He was here because they had invited him. Not to speak, but to witness, to listen to their truth, their pain, their hope for change. As the room fell silent and the sisters prepared to begin their testimony, Zach leaned forward slightly, ready to hear every word. The city boardroom hummed with tension as sunlight streamed through tall windows. Every seat was filled, reporters with notebooks poised, activists wearing buttons and carrying signs, concerned citizens leaning forward in their chairs. At the front, 5 Oversight board members sat behind a long mahogany table, their faces serious under the fluorescent lights. In the very back row, Zach Hill tried to make himself smaller, though his heart pounded so loud he was sure others could hear it. 3 TV cameras mounted on tripods recorded silently from the corners. The air felt thick with anticipation. Board Chairwoman Martinez adjusted her microphone. We'll now hear testimony from Imani and Amara Rollins regarding the incident of July 15th. The sisters rose from their seats in the front row. Imani, tall and composed in a navy blazer, guided Amara, who wore a simple white blouse, to the podium. Their footsteps echoed in the hushed room. Imani spoke first, her voice clear and steady. My name is Imani Rollins. I'm 16 years old. She paused, scanning the room. On July 15th, my sister and I were waiting for our mother outside Willow Heights when Officer Zachary Hill arrived. What happened next changed us forever. She described the escalating terror of those moments, how quickly Zach's tone had shifted from questioning to threatening, how her attempts to explain were cut off, how fear had gripped her chest when he reached for his cuffs. I was 16, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. And I was treated like I was dangerous for existing, for standing, for speaking, for being black in a space someone decided I didn't belong in. Several audience members nodded. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes. The physical bruises healed, Imani continued. But the other marks, the ones you can't see, those are still with us. Every police car that passes makes my heart race. Every siren makes me wonder, will today be another day when existing is enough to make me a threat? She stepped back, squeezing Amara's hand as they switched places. Amara's hands shook as she unfolded her prepared statement. The microphone picked up the rustle of paper. My name is Amara Rollins, she began softly. I'm 14 years old. She swallowed hard. Before July 15th, I used to walk our dog alone. I used to get the mail. I used to feel safe in my own neighborhood. Her voice trembled but grew stronger. I haven't walked alone since that day, not even to the mailbox. The room was absolutely still. One board member dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. When Officer Hill grabbed my wrist, Amara continued, I thought I was going to die. That's not dramatic. That's what it felt like. That's what it still feels like sometimes, in my nightmares. She took a shaky breath. I keep asking myself what I did wrong, but I know now I didn't do anything wrong. I was just a kid, waiting for my mom. In the back row, Zach's chest felt tight. Each word hit him like a physical blow. Amara finished reading, her final words hanging in the air. We're not asking for pity. We're asking for change. Because no child should feel like their life might end for simply existing in their own skin. Board Chairwoman Martinez leaned forward. Thank you both for your incredible bravery in sharing your experience. She paused, looking around the room. Would anyone else like to offer testimony regarding this incident or similar experiences? The room remained silent. Then Board Member Thompson, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, cleared his throat. Officer Hill is here, isn't he? His voice carried clearly through the speakers. Zach felt his body go rigid. Dozens of heads turned, searching the crowd. Would you like to respond? Thompson asked, his eyes finding Zach in the back row. The silence grew heavier. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens ready. Chief Rollins, seated quietly in the middle section, didn't turn around. Zach's fingers brushed against the folded paper in his pocket. The words he'd stayed up late writing, trying to find the right way to express everything he'd learned. His legs felt wooden as he slowly stood. The paper crinkled as he pulled it out, his hands visibly shaking. The walk to the front seemed to take forever, each step echoing in the silent room. He could feel every eye on him, could sense the mix of curiosity and judgment in their stares. As he approached the podium, he passed within feet of Imani and Amara, who had returned to their seats. Neither girl looked at him, but he saw Amara's shoulders tense as he walked by. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Zach made his way to the podium, his footsteps echoing in the hushed chamber. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper he'd brought, the one he'd stayed up late writing, trying to find the right words. But as he looked up and saw Imani and Amara sitting in the front row, their faces a mixture of wariness and expectation, he knew prepared statements wouldn't do. He cleared his throat and set the paper aside. You've already told the truth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I just want to confirm it. The microphone picked up his shaky breath. Cameras whirred softly in the back of the room. A reporter's pen scratched against paper. That day when I got the call about suspicious persons, Zach continued, I made assumptions before I even arrived. I saw 2 black teenagers and immediately classified them as threats. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't see 2 girls waiting for their ride. I saw what I was trained to see, what I allowed myself to see. He gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white. I had power that day, a badge, a gun, the authority to detain, and I wielded that power not because of any real threat, but because I could. Because somewhere along the way I learned that control meant safety and fear meant respect. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Zach pressed on, his voice growing stronger even as his eyes stung with tears. I told myself I was following protocol. That's what we always say, isn't it? Just doing our jobs? He shook his head. But protocol doesn't explain why my hand went to my weapon when Imani asked a simple question. Protocol doesn't justify why I grabbed Amara's wrist so hard it left bruises. That wasn't protocol. That was fear disguising itself as authority. In the audience, several people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. Amara stared at her hands folded in her lap while Imani watched him intently. I've spent 17 years in law enforcement, Zach continued, his voice heavy with realization. 17 years being trained to see threats instead of people, to assume guilt instead of innocence, to react with force instead of compassion. He paused, swallowing hard. And if this system made me think I was doing the right thing, then maybe I wasn't the only one broken. The silence in the room grew deeper. Even the reporters had stopped writing, their pens frozen mid-sentence. I stand here today not to defend my actions, but to condemn them, to condemn a culture that teaches officers to fear the very communities we're supposed to protect, to condemn a mindset that values compliance over humanity. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks now, but he didn't wipe them away. What I did to these young women wasn't just wrong. It was a betrayal of everything I once thought my badge represented. And I know now that no amount of training reform or sensitivity workshops can fix what's fundamentally broken in how we approach policing. He looked directly at Imani and Amara again, his voice softening. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm willing to live the rest of my life trying to be someone who does. The last words hung in the air. For several long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft whir of camera motors. Then, somewhere in the middle of the room, a single person began to clap. Another joined in. Like a wave building strength, the applause spread until the entire room was on its feet. The sound filled the chamber, echoing off the walls. But Zach didn't acknowledge the standing ovation. He simply stepped away from the podium, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face wet with tears. Without looking at anyone, he made his way back to his seat in the last row. As he sat down, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. Chief Rollins, seated a few rows ahead, gave a single, subtle nod. The gesture was barely perceptible, but in it, Zach saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement of the truth he'd finally spoken. The applause continued to thunder through the room as Zach sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. Chief Rollins pulled into her driveway, the headlights sweeping across the familiar landscape of her front yard. The clock on her dashboard read 10:45 p.m. She'd stayed late at the station, dealing with paperwork and the aftermath of the Oversight board meeting. A bag of groceries sat in her passenger seat, just some essentials she'd picked up on the way home. The porch light was off, casting the front of the house in shadow. Amara must have forgotten to turn it on again. Desiree made a mental note to remind her daughter about home security protocols, especially now. She grabbed the grocery bag and stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the concrete driveway. That's when she saw it. The garage door loomed before her, its white surface defaced by angry red letters sprayed across the middle. Traitor. The paint was still fresh, tiny droplets running down the metal surface like bloody tears. Desiree's hand tightened on her car keys until the metal bit into her palm. Her heart raced, but years of training kept her movements measured, controlled. She scanned the darkness around her house, looking for any movement, any sign of the perpetrator. Inside the house, she set the groceries down harder than intended. The thud echoed through the quiet home. Footsteps thundered down the stairs almost immediately. Amara appeared first, her face worried. Imani followed close behind, always the more cautious of the two. "Mom?" Amara started to ask, but before she could finish her question, the night exploded. The crash came from the living room, a brick sailing through the front window, sending glass spraying across the floor like deadly confetti. The sound was deafening in the quiet house. "Down," Desiree commanded, her police training kicking in instantly. All three dropped to the floor, Desiree pulling both girls close to her. Glass crunched under their bodies as they crawled away from the windows. Silence fell again, heavy and threatening. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Neighbors must have called it in. Desiree's mind raced through possibilities, through faces at the station, through recent conversations. This felt personal. Too personal. Minutes that felt like hours passed before red and blue lights began flashing outside their windows, casting eerie shadows through the broken glass. Desiree heard car doors slam, footsteps approaching. But something was off. The response was too casual, too unhurried for an attack on the chief of police's home. Officers finally entered through the front door, led by Sergeant Thompson. His movements were sluggish, almost reluctant. His eyes wouldn't meet hers directly. "I want a full sweep," Desiree ordered, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority despite their position still huddled on the floor. "Of course, Chief," Thompson replied, but the hesitation in his voice was unmistakable. His eyes flickered away too quickly, his stance too loose for an active crime scene. Amara's fingers dug into Desiree's arm. "Are we safe?" she whispered, fear making her voice tremble. Desiree looked at her daughter's face, then at Imani's equally concerned expression. The truth stuck in her throat. The officers moved through the house with none of the urgency such an attack demanded. Their radios crackled with coded messages, but their sweeps were perfunctory at best. Desiree watched them, her cop instincts screaming warnings at every half-hearted gesture, every avoided glance. Through the broken window, she could see two officers in the front yard. Officer Martinez and Officer Riley stood near the garage, their flashlights barely scanning the area. Then she saw it. A quick exchange of looks between them, loaded with meaning. A silent communication that spoke volumes. That's when she knew. The attack hadn't come from outside the department. The paint was still fresh. The brick had come right after they'd arrived home. The slow response. The reluctant investigation. It had come from within. Desiree watched the officers moving around her property, her mind cataloging every gesture, every averted gaze. The betrayal sat heavy in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. She needed to protect her girls. She needed to think several steps ahead. Sergeant Thompson approached again, notepad in hand but barely used. "We'll file a report, Chief. Probably just some kids." "Thank you, Sergeant," she cut him off, her tone arctic. "I'll expect that report on my desk first thing tomorrow morning, complete with photos of the scene and all witness statements from the neighbors." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having planned to do any of that. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, turning away too quickly. Desiree held her daughters close as they watched the officers leave, their patrol cars pulling away with none of the urgency that should accompany an attack on a fellow officer's home. The red and blue lights faded, leaving them in darkness again. She saw another knowing look exchanged between the last two officers as they walked to their car. Their faces were partially hidden in shadow, but their body language spoke clearly enough. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. The heavy manila envelope landed on Desiree's desk with a soft thud. No markings except her name typed in plain font. She glanced at her office door, then carefully broke the seal. Inside, she found a USB drive and a stack of printed documents. Personnel files, internal memos, and time-stamped security logs spilled across her desk. But it was the contents of the drive that made her hands go cold. The first video clip showed the exterior of her home 2 nights ago. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. A figure in dark clothes moved through the frame, stopping at her garage door. Even in the grainy footage, the practiced movements were unmistakable. The stance, the way he checked his surroundings. This was someone with law enforcement training. When the figure turned slightly, adjusting his hoodie, Desiree's breath caught. The spray paint can glinted in the streetlight as Officer Gary Lance began defacing her property. "Dear God," she whispered, pausing the footage. She'd known Gary Lance for over 2 decades. He'd been there when she first made detective, always quick with a smile and a helping hand. But something had changed in recent years. Subtle at first, then more obvious. His resistance to new policies, his complaints about political correctness taking over the force. The next clip showed him parking his personal vehicle 2 streets away, methodically wiping down the door handles before walking toward her house. The brick sailed through her window at 2:53 a.m., the trajectory perfect, the throw precise. When he turned to flee, his hood slipped back just enough to confirm what she already knew. Desiree's hands shook as she rifled through the personnel files. There it was. Lance had been on desk duty the night Zach was arrested, his signature on the booking forms, his initials on every page. She remembered how calm he'd seemed, how he'd defended Zach during the initial review. "Just following procedure," Lance had said. "Hill's a good cop. This is getting blown out of proportion." Her phone buzzed. A text from Imani. "You vouched for him." 3 simple words that felt like an accusation. Desiree closed her eyes, remembering all the times she'd defended Lance to other officers, to the review board, even to her own daughters. She'd told them he was one of the good ones. With trembling fingers, she dialed Zach's number. He answered on the second ring. "Chief?" His voice was uncertain, wary. "Did you know?" she asked without preamble. "Know what?" "About Lance, the garage, the brick." There was a long pause. When Zach spoke again, his voice shook. "I didn't know, I swear. He was my training officer, my mentor, but I never thought—" He trailed off. "He defended you," Desiree said flatly. "Through everything. Why?" "I don't—" Zach stopped, and she could hear him piecing it together. "Because I was like him, because I did exactly what he trained me to do." The truth of it hung heavy between them. "We have to clean house," Desiree said simply, then ended the call. She spread the evidence across her desk, years of complaints buried in personnel files, incident reports that had been quietly amended, training evaluations that praised decisive action while ignoring excessive force. A pattern emerged. Lance hadn't just trained officers, he'd shaped them in his image. The security footage played on her screen. She watched Lance check his surroundings one last time before disappearing into the night. Not just a betrayal of her trust, but of everything the badge was supposed to represent. In his home across town, Zach sat motionless, phone still pressed to his ear long after the call ended. His eyes drifted to the framed photo on his shelf, his academy graduation day. Lance stood beside him, both smiling proudly in their dress uniforms. He remembered Lance's words that day. "We look after our own." Now those words carried a different weight. Zach stood slowly, took the frame down, and let it drop into the trash bin beside his desk. The glass cracked on impact, splintering across their smiling faces. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty park bench where Zach sat, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He watched young families stroll by, their laughter and chatter feeling like it belonged to another world entirely, one he was no longer part of. A mother pulled her child closer as they passed, recognition flickering across her face. Zach took another sip of his bitter coffee, grimacing at both the taste and the familiar sting of rejection. His phone lay heavy in his pocket, silent for days now. He'd reached out twice this week, once with a carefully worded text message to both girls, and later with a voicemail that felt hollow even as he recorded it. "I know I don't deserve a response," he had said into the void, "but I want you to know I'm still listening, still learning." No reply came, not that he expected one. The morning joggers and dog walkers thinned out as the sun climbed higher. Zach pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the Messages app. The last text he'd sent to Imani showed as delivered, but unread. Amara's number now just showed an error message. Blocked. He opened social media almost unconsciously, though he'd deleted most of his own accounts days ago. A news site's video autoplayed, showing Imani at the podium during her testimony. Her voice came through clear and strong. "I was 16 and I was treated like I was dangerous for existing." The comments below overflowed with support for her. She was becoming something of an icon, her composed strength resonating with people across the country. Zach closed the app, his chest tight. Standing up from the bench, he began walking with no real destination in mind. His feet carried him down familiar streets that now felt foreign. Outside the local cafe where he used to grab breakfast before shifts, he paused. Through the window, he recognized Sarah, the morning barista who used to have his order ready before he reached the counter. The bell chimed as he entered. Sarah's smile dropped when she saw him. He stepped up to order, but she turned away, calling to her coworker, "I'm taking my break." She disappeared into the back without another glance. Zach backed out of the line, ignoring the whispers from other customers who recognized him. Back on the street, he walked faster, head down. The hardware store sign caught his eye. He needed light bulbs anyway. Inside, he nearly bumped into Mike, a guy he'd known since high school. Their eyes met. Mike's face hardened, and without a word, he set down his shopping basket and walked straight out the door. The message was clear. There was no place for him here anymore. Back home, Zach checked his phone again out of habit. Still nothing. He opened his contacts, scrolling to Amara's number. The block notification stared back at him. Imani's thread remained unchanged, his message sitting there unread like an accusation. Standing in his living room, everything felt temporary, unsettled. Maybe it was time to leave Crestfield. Start fresh somewhere his face wasn't plastered across the local news. Somewhere the weight of his actions didn't follow him down every street. He pulled out a duffel bag from his closet and started throwing in clothes without really looking at them. Toiletries. A few important documents. His movements were mechanical, unthinking. Then he saw it. The small black notebook sitting on his kitchen counter. He stopped, bag half packed, and picked it up. The pages were filled with his hurried writing from after each reconciliation meeting. Notes about his reactions, his realizations, his shame. Things he wished he'd said better. Things he finally understood. The last page was blank, waiting. Zach sat down at the kitchen table and picked up a pen. He held it over the empty page, but no words came. What was left to say that hadn't been said? What could he possibly write that would matter now? The pen remained motionless in his hand. His phone stayed silent on the table. The blank page stared back at him, offering no answers. For once, Zach didn't try to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. He didn't reach for his phone to send another unread message. He simply sat there, pen idle, and waited, finally understanding that sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing at all. The afternoon sun filtered through Zach's living room window as he trudged up his front steps, exhausted from another day of avoiding familiar faces around town. His mailbox creaked as he opened it, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Bills as expected. A handful of junk mail. Then, at the bottom of the stack, an envelope caught his eye. No return address. Just his name and address written in neat, curly handwriting that made his heart skip a beat. He recognized those loops and swirls immediately. He'd seen them on the statement Amara read at the Oversight board meeting. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his house key. Inside, Zach set the other mail aside without even glancing at it. He sank into his worn armchair, the envelope feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part wanted to preserve this moment of possibility before whatever words inside changed everything again. Taking a deep breath, he carefully opened the envelope. The letter was short, just a few lines on a single sheet of notebook paper. The same neat handwriting filled less than half the page, but each word carried weight. You were right, it wasn't the badge, it was the man wearing it, but people can change, even scared ones. Come to Crestfield High Auditorium, March 10th, 6 p.m. Zach read it 3 times, letting each word sink in. His vision blurred slightly as he focused on that first line. You were right. How long had he waited to hear any acknowledgement from either of the girls? And now here it was, in Amara's own handwriting. The invitation itself was cryptic. No explanation of what would happen at the auditorium, no context for why she wanted him there. It could be anything. A public forum on police reform, a student presentation about their experience, maybe even some kind of confrontation. The uncertainty made his stomach twist. But the date stood out clearly. March 10th, 4 days away. Zach walked to his kitchen where a basic calendar hung on the wall. He picked up a pen and circled the date, drawing the line around it several times until the circle was bold and dark. Whatever was going to happen that evening, he would be there. Returning to his chair, he picked up the small black notebook that had been sitting untouched on his side table for days. The same notebook where he'd documented his journey through the reconciliation meetings, where he'd poured out his realizations and regrets. He flipped past all his previous entries until he reached that final blank page that had defeated him before. This time, the words came, "Amara reached out today. After everything, after the arrest, the reconciliation meetings, the testimony, the silence, she found a way to see past the man I was. Not to forgive, maybe, but to acknowledge change is possible, even for someone like me, even for the scared man behind the badge who couldn't see past his own fear." His pen moved steadily now, filling the page with his response to her letter. Not excuses or defenses, but honest reflection about what her acknowledgement meant. About how her words, "people can change," felt like both a challenge and a lifeline. When he finished writing, Zach carefully folded Amara's letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, pressing it against his chest. The paper crinkled softly as he whispered, "I'll be there." March 10th, 5:50 p.m. Zach's hands trembled as he pulled open the heavy doors of Crestfield High's auditorium. The buzz of conversation hit him first, then the sheer number of people. Every seat seemed taken. Students in their blue and gold uniforms, parents clutching programs, reporters with notebooks poised. Camera flashes dotted the crowd like fireflies. His eyes lifted to the colorful banners hanging from the rafters. Voices of youth, truth, justice, and tomorrow, stretched across in bold letters, catching the light. The message felt both hopeful and heavy. Zach hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. A few heads turned his way, whispers following. He spotted an empty seat in the back row and made his way there quickly, keeping his head down. The familiar silhouette of Chief Rollins caught his eye. She sat ramrod straight 2 rows ahead, her presence commanding even in silence. The lights dimmed slightly and a hush fell over the crowd. Imani and Amara walked onto the stage with measured steps. They looked different than they had in the reconciliation room. Stronger, taller somehow. Imani wore a deep blue blazer while Amara had chosen a simple white dress. They stood together at the podium, their presence filling the space. "Good evening," Imani began, her voice clear and steady. "We're here tonight to share something personal, something true." Amara stepped forward slightly. "What you're about to see isn't about blame or shame. It's about being seen. Really seen." The screen behind them flickered to life. Bold white text appeared, "Seen." Zach's breath caught as the first images appeared. The dashcam footage he'd watched so many times in his nightmares played out in stark black and white. His own voice, harsh and commanding, filled the auditorium. He watched himself approach the girls, hand near his belt. The camera captured every moment, his escalating tone, Amara's tears, Imani's quiet dignity crumbling as the cuffs went on. The auditorium lights brightened slowly, revealing tear-stained faces and stunned expressions throughout the crowd. Applause thundered through the space, rising to a standing ovation. People called out words of support, some holding up phones to capture the moment. Through it all, Zach remained seated in his back row chair, hands folded in his lap. Students crowded around Imani and Amara, offering hugs and congratulations. The sisters stood tall, accepting the praise with grace that seemed beyond their years. Amara's white dress caught the stage lights, making her look almost ethereal as she embraced her friends. Imani's blue blazer remained crisp and professional as she shook hands with teachers and community leaders. A local news crew pushed through the crowd, microphone extended. "Imani, Amara, can you tell us what inspired this project?" The reporter's voice carried across the noise. The girls handled the questions with poise, their responses measured and thoughtful. Zach watched from his distant seat, careful not to draw attention to himself. The celebration continued to build. Parents approached with proud smiles, praising the girls' bravery. Fellow students clustered nearby, some crying, others nodding in understanding. A few held up their phones, capturing quick photos with the sisters. Through it all, Zach stayed rooted to his chair, a quiet observer to their triumph. A tall shadow suddenly fell across his lap. He looked up to find Chief Rollins standing beside him, her expression unreadable. She didn't take the empty seat next to him. Instead, She stood straight, hands clasped behind her back, watching her daughters receive their well-deserved recognition. "You let them tell the story," she said quietly, not looking at him. "That's more than most men would have done." Zach nodded slightly but kept his silence. What could he say? This wasn't about him or his growth or his redemption. This was their moment, earned through pain he had caused, transformed into something powerful. A reporter noticed them and started making his way through the crowd, notepad already out. Chief Rollins raised her hand in a firm gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "Not tonight," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The reporter retreated, looking disappointed. The crowd had thinned slightly around the girls, giving them a moment to breathe. That's when they noticed him. Imani spotted him first, nudging her sister gently. Both girls turned, their eyes finding his in the back row. The moment stretched between them. Not warm, not cold, just honest. No one moved. Imani raised her hand in a small wave, subtle but deliberate. Beside her, Amara gave a slight nod, her eyes clear and steady. The gesture wasn't forgiveness or friendship. It was something different. Recognition. Acknowledgement of truth shared and heard. Then the moment passed. Someone called the girls' names and they turned back to their celebration. More hugs, more photos, more congratulations. The sound of their laughter mixed with the general chatter of the crowd. Zach stood quietly, gathering his jacket. No one noticed as he made his way to the side exit, slipping through the heavy door into the evening air. The noise from inside became muffled, then faded entirely as the door clicked shut behind him. The night was cool and clear. Streetlights cast soft circles on the empty sidewalk. In the distance, cars hummed past on the main road. Zach paused, taking a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile crossed his face. Not because anyone was watching, not because he'd been forgiven, but because, finally, there was peace. The truth had been told, not his version, not anyone else's version, but their truth. And he had learned to listen. That was enough. 5 months later, the July heat pressed against the windows of Crestfield High's auditorium. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly as proud families filled the rows of seats. Colorful banners celebrating student achievements hung from the rafters, and a podium stood center stage, adorned with fresh flowers. Zach Hill slipped in through the back entrance, choosing a seat in the last row where shadows met light. He wore plain clothes, khakis and a blue button-down, and kept his eyes forward, aware that some in the crowd still recognized him from the news coverage months ago. Principal Martinez approached the podium, tapping the microphone twice. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we celebrate excellence in our community. Our first presentation is the Social Justice Leadership Scholarship." Zach's hands tightened slightly in his lap as Imani Rollins stood from her seat in the front row. She walked to the stage with the same quiet confidence he remembered from their first meeting. Head high, shoulders back, each step measured and sure. "This year's recipient," Principal Martinez continued, "has shown extraordinary courage in transforming personal adversity into community dialogue. Her documentary, Seen, has been viewed by police departments across 3 states as part of their sensitivity training. Please welcome Imani Rollins." The applause was genuine and warm. In the third row, Amara beamed, holding up her phone to record her sister's moment. Chief Rollins sat beside her, pride evident in her straight posture and slight smile. Imani adjusted the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "When I was younger, my mother taught me that speaking up isn't just about being heard. It's about opening doors for others to speak too." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "This scholarship means more than just college funding. It represents every difficult conversation that helped create change, every person who chose to listen instead of defend, every step toward understanding." From his spot in the back, Zach noticed how her hands remained steady on the podium, so different from the trembling fingers he'd seen during their first reconciliation meeting. She'd grown stronger, but not harder. That was the miracle of it. After the ceremony, people spilled out into the warm evening air, gathering in happy clusters for photos. Proud parents hugged their children, and camera flashes lit up the growing dusk. Zach stood to the side, uncertain whether to leave or stay, when he noticed a small crowd gathering near the front doors. Principal Martinez was unveiling something on the wall, a bronze plaque that caught the last rays of sunlight. Zach moved closer, careful to maintain his distance from the main group. The words etched in metal made his breath catch. The Amara and Imani Truth Room for Conversations That Matter. He read it 3 times, remembering the stark conference room where they'd first confronted him, where anger had slowly given way to understanding, where truth had finally found its voice. "What do you think?" The voice startled him. Amara stood there, looking at the plaque with a gentle expression. Before he could step back, she moved forward and wrapped her arms around him in a quick, firm hug. Zach froze, overwhelmed by the simple human contact. Imani approached more slowly, her scholarship certificate rolled carefully in one hand. She stood before him, studying his face with those same clear eyes that had once demanded his truth. The silence stretched between them until she spoke. "You're not our villain anymore." She paused, letting the words settle. "And maybe that's enough." Zach blinked rapidly, feeling tears threaten. He wanted to speak, to express something profound about growth or gratitude, but all the words felt inadequate. Instead, he simply nodded, understanding that sometimes silence carries its own kind of truth. Families continued taking photos around them. Someone laughed loudly nearby. A car horn honked in the distance. Life moved forward, as it always did, while this small moment of grace played out quietly in its midst. The girls turned away, drawn back into the celebration by friends calling their names. Zach watched them go, these young women who had taught him more about courage than his entire police career ever had. He walked slowly toward the parking lot, each step measured and thoughtful. At the edge of the sidewalk, he turned back one last time, looking at the plaque that would remain long after this evening faded into memory. The bronze letters caught the last light of day. Truth Room, for Conversations That Matter. If you enjoyed the story of Zach, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of Zach, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.